All right, so then let's, did I leave the example of the timer up from the other page? I didn't. No. Well, let's work on a lap timer then. I guess is what we'll do today is we're going to try and build out a lap timer into our stopwatch so that we can show some of this other stuff. I mean, you already got this working?
Not very cute, but it's working.
It's not very cute, but it's working.
No. Yeah, I haven't had time to stop playing it. And I also can upload all the updates to my GitHub repo.
Okay.
So problems going out. Yeah, and I'm seeing there that I'm going to get things started. I just type in npm start and it's not working. So
And it's crashing on you.
yeah.
Strip ANSI line 471.
What?
That's I don't know, I keep getting that code, that error saying, I think they're very similar.
What is it?
It's like missing, I don't know if when I first spun it up, it's like missing a file. The error that it gives me, cannot find module strip dash ANSI. So that one I just basically have to like reinstall.
Yeah, if you did npm install, that should fix that, I would hope.
Yes, it has been fixing it. Do you have a fix that is working for you?
I mean, I get like, I don't know if it's the same error. The last I had was the 471 thing, couldn't find the scripts thing. But I reinstalled EDM every time. And
Yeah, that's what I'm doing.
But I really don't know, and I wasn't working in my Visual Studio Code thing, so I wasn't working locally. But I think that could be if we're working on C9.
Yeah.
Really don't
Oh yeah,
know.
I think it's Cloud 9.
Yeah.
Word.
So now I have problems. I mean, I was working at home just for computer. Let me see.
All right.
And one thing that I found with Kotlin is if I install some npm thing like style components or whatever the thing like material, every time I open up C9 again, they're not there. I have to reinstall those things again. So it doesn't compile. Because I can't find them.
It's interesting. It must be
It's annoying.
It must be like not saving the state of your Cloud9 environment or resetting you to a previous environment.
I think there's some,
Yeah,
but I don't know how to.
it's been a while since I've really dug into that. I feel like, since they've been bought by Amazon, there've been some quirks on the way that they're doing some of that stuff. And so they may be having problems with their legacy environments, not playing nice with their new environments that they're setting up for the Amazon migration. So we'll have to look at that again and see if it's continuing to work, if we need to approach something different going forward for a coding environment. It's definitely still an improvement over when we were spending a lot of time getting everybody ramped up independently on different coding environments, like whatever their laptop was. But I'm sure it's a space where there's other competitors as well. Huh. Well, yeah, we'll dive into this a little bit, and if you keep having issues, I'm sure there'll be a time where I'm ready to take a break and we can step over and see if we can work through what's going on. So I know that people had split up and we talked about, you got it working? Did you just need to install again or?
I have reinstalled my phone, so because I covered.
Right.
I use that one, but yeah. Yeah, but it's every time I'm.
Huh. It's really weird.
I did change a couple of things that I had on my previous version of the stopwatch. I don't know if I did it right or if the best practice to do that, but like the time display, now my time display component is just like display eventually. But it's not formatting the time,
Mm-hmm.
you know, like all this
Right.
milliseconds divided,
Right.
60 and models of. I put that in, like in a function, like a const functional thing in the stopwatch main. Use that not only for the main display, but also for the lab time display.
Ah.
Because I needed to.
Yeah.
It's just, so that was a thing that I needed to change, and I added 2 files, lab button and lab display. That's it.
Nice. No, I like that. To tell you the truth, yeah, if I write this stuff out, I have a tendency myself to try and keep as little logic as possible in my components in terms of things like breaking stuff up. I usually like to split those out into functions. So I'll have a like, you know, if I was writing this not for class here, but writing this myself for a project, yeah, I can make this larger too. But writing this for work, then the usual way that I would do this is I would actually have separate functions here that would be like get hours, get minutes, you know, get seconds or whatever, get tenths of a second, and I would just pass the time in and get back the value out of each one of those separately. But the nice thing about doing that is, like you said, it's reusable elsewhere.
Within the stopwatch component, I mean, I have, you know, like, I'm rendering the lab time is still in the seconds.
Mm-hmm.
From,
Right.
Last time. And it just formatting that when.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why I say, I mean, I'm sure that there's an easy or less clumsy way to do it. Because it's like a lot of information.
Yeah, there's different approaches. None of them are, I would say, like, at least based off what you described, like, I think that's a perfectly valid approach. I'll probably take something that's just a slightly different direction, but not much, for the way that we handle it. But I think you'll see the commonality, right? So I think that's great. So all right, so tackling this, right? What am I going to do here for building the lap timer? Yeah, I think the first thing is I'm going to have a button, right? Okay, so I already have this nice simple button component. He can get passed in, whether he's clicked. You can even have a color passed in. In fact, it sort of requires it. And then let's go look at like an implementation of it. Our start pause button, right? Which says our color is primary, et cetera. So I'm going to, again, you've seen me do this many times. Nice lazy person. I want to borrow my code here. And yeah, I'm going to create yet another button like you were talking about. So this is like the lap button. And I'll start saying, all right, how does this work? Well, this is a lap button. It's just like our start pause button, pretty much. It's going to use a button internally. Its text will be like, I don't know, lap slash interval or something. Doesn't matter. Now it's not going to have, we can pass is running into it as a property, but it's not going to change its text. What we can do is expect it to get passed in. And this We had like on starter pause, on lap. I'll have that be our primary right now. And then what I'm going to do is set the disabled state just right here to like this dot props dot. Let me double check something. Sorry. I want to make sure I'm naming it right. I called it is loading here. All right. This dot props dot. Wait, is running. This, so I want this to be disabled when we're not running, I guess, not this dot props dot is running. So disabled should be true when this is false. I think that works roughly.
I do the same thing, but I just use an is, like, if props clickable, and then the clickable props were like,
Right.
it's running, yes, no, so, but yeah.
Yeah. I think any of that works too, right? And I'm going through this part because it's not that complex, right? Just copying another button. We'll dive in and maybe build out some of the other stuff together a little more. But right now I'm just sort of working through this. Now I think it makes sense to like put this on its own line, like below some of the other stuff. So I'm just going to throw an extra line here. And just like anything else, I need to import this guy. So we'll import this. I'll put the .js here, although usually in my own writing I a lot of times don't, but I will. And then we should be able to use it. Even if we're not passing anything in that it's going to do. Let's see what happens. We got like all right, yeah, it's like a lap interval button. We can press it when we're running, right? Nothing too fancy here. So now we start getting into the question about the actual logic behind it, right? That's pretty straightforward part. Building out that. So now we know we want to do something. We want to pass in some sort of function to this guy. When we have completed our lap, right? What do I have here? This is sort of weird. Start or pause.
You still have that your test console testing code there?
That might be what some of this is. Well, no. Oh, this is about slowing down the system, right?
Yeah.
This is all the logic around, I want to be able to slow this guy down. So I'm going to get rid of all that. That was just to show the problems that you can have if you're, there we go. I was like, what is this? All right, so we're going to have some sort of on lap or interval or whatever we want to call it. Of course, the first thing we can do is just, right, make sure that it's all working. Pass this guy in. See if this works. Open my dev tools so I can see the results. First things first is it's not firing when it's not enabled. And it, yep, fires when I expect it, right? So this is sort of like the process I would take. Let me bring that back because I'm just going to leave these dev tools up most of the time today. I'm going to make this just a tiny bit smaller, assuming people can still read that. All right, so now comes the part where we start getting into some of the trickier bits. How are we going to, what do we want to do when the lap button is pressed, right? So let's make sure we go over what our current logic is again with how we're recording the time with these intervals, just so that we're all on the same page, and then we'll try and figure out together what we want the logic to be for the lap button being pressed. And you notice what I've done here sort of separate out, again, process of software development. It's really important to not try and tackle everything at once, right? So we tackled the process of adding, like, we did the easy part in a sense. Okay, it's easy to add another button. We did that. We've got a button in there. We even are triggering on the click. So now we're not dealing with the logic of just putting this button in there when we're going to be trying to figure out how to compute the lap being pressed and all of that. We're dealing with each part of this problem separately. And that's one of the best things to learn when you're doing software development, is to learn to tackle one piece, one small part of the problem, and then assume that the other parts are working. In a sense, this is like pseudocode or an assumption, right? Right now, I assume that this on lap button does what I need it to do, or on lap callback, and the lap button just gets it. So he gets to be completely ignorant. He doesn't have to worry about whether that's functional, and we just get to build this out separately. This is something I can't emphasize enough when it comes to learning how to build out software, is learning to think in these pieces, learning to just mock out what you need. So it's like, oh, I'm going to want to have a function call of some kind here. So I'll make a function that does nothing, and I'll be able to call it, but I'll assume that it's going to do what I want it to do. And then I'll figure out how I do that afterwards. That way I'm not trying to tackle all the bits at once. So going back, let's, again, take a look. What's our logic here for our time? Hey. So we're starting with elapsed time of 0, right? That's nice and simple. And then when we start, when we hit the start button, we set our state to running, and we're using this previous tick value that we're adding to our state, and we're setting it to the time when the button was pressed. So that's being set to the previous tick. And then roughly every 10 milliseconds, we're running this tick logic. So what we have now is our elapsed time of 0 still, we didn't change that, is running is set to true. And our previous tick value is set to the time that we recorded this into our state. And then we hook up our interval that's going to fire every 10 milliseconds. And when that fires, what it does is it captures the time now. And then it sets our elapsed time. So that's the total elapsed time to whatever was in there before. So the first time this is going to fire, that's 0. And then it adds to that whatever the time now is minus the time from the last tick, the last time we ran this, and it updates the last time we ran this. So basically it's just making sure that we're updating that elapsed time, we're adding to it whatever time has passed since the last time that this tick method fired, every time that this runs. That's what's happening in there, right? So those are really our only values that we have at this point. Elapsed time, previous tick is running, that's our state. So the question is, what logic do we want when we click the lap button? This is the interesting, like, this is the more programming puzzle part of the problem versus the React specific part of the problem. So how do we think, any great thoughts on how to implement this or what to do? What do you got?
I don't think it's necessarily a great thought. It's quite a setup. My idea was, and I did get it working, was to use, create a new value in state called lap times. That's an array. It's an empty array, and then
Okay,
essentially every time you hit the lap button, it puts in that value into the array. That gives you enough data to work with.
let's even do it right at the beginning. Lap times. Let's start with an array. Like that?
Yeah.
All right.
I'm sure there's other approaches.
And you said whenever you hit the lap button, it puts the current time in the array?
Yeah.
All right. So that'll be, yeah, we're fine there. So I'm going to do something probably a little different syntax than you might be thinking. I'm going to break it out a little bit. So let me say let lap times equals this dot state dot lap times to get my array. And I'm breaking it out just to make this a little easier to understand what I'm doing. And now we want to add in our elapsed time to this, essentially, right? So so this is where I'm going to do something probably a little different than you did, because I'm going to guess, I could be wrong, that what was done was lap times dot push or something like that. Like this
I think I copied some of your code, so
dot state dot
not do that.
elapsed time. Ah, okay. So you may have issue, and I don't think this will actually show up as necessarily an issue. Actually, I think this would. I think if we tried this, we would have a problem with this. But can people explain to me why we would have a problem with it? This is an interesting thing. So then if we did like this dot set state, right, because we want to update our lap times. Like if we try, let me not even do this. Let's just leave it this way right now. And you're thinking, okay, well, I updated my value here, right? Is that going to actually work and show us like what those lap times are?
I didn't do it.
You don't know?
Like that.
Yeah.
Like adding to the array value, but that value calculated what was the lap time, so I need to do some operation there.
Right. And I'm gonna come. We'll come back and get there.
That was like kind of.
We'll get there. That's part of this idea of me breaking this down bit by bit too. Is I'm not even going to solve that problem yet. I'm going to start with the just pushing something, getting something set up, right? But there is a problem with this. It's very subtle, very easy to miss, and very you really have to understand JavaScript to understand the problem. So right now we've got a problem if we didn't call set state. So we didn't tell React to update its state.
I have a question. The array that you made, the lap time times array.
Yes.
Within the state, like in the beginning.
Yeah. Right. Hold on, let me close this. I added it right here just now. So I set it to it. I defaulted it to an empty
Changing
array.
the state without using set state.
Oh yeah. Well, that's the problem first. The first problem, right, is we're not using set state. So this isn't telling React that the state has updated, right? So here I'm going to do something really basic here, even though I shouldn't do this. I'm gonna I shouldn't say shouldn't, but I'm gonna go ahead and put some code right in line here. Do a rough render of whatever the lap times are, just so that we have something, right? And then we'll refine it more later. Return, what do I want to return? It's very, very simple. I'll just do a div. With the time in it. So this is very, like, I'm just iterating over anything in this array and just saying, give me back. This is essentially, I wrote basically an inline component almost. It just takes the time, gives you back a div in the time, right? And so right now, before I've even done anything else, let's see what happens in the code. I'm doing something wrong with some styling, but let me see if I can fix that so it quits showing up. That's probably what was yelling. And then this guy, I don't know, just get rid of those. See if it fixes it. All right, I just don't want that there. We're yelling about some other stuff, but nothing too bad. Let's see what happens. Cannot read property state of undefined. Ah, yes. I knew this was going to happen. I intended for it, and then I forgot. Does anybody realize what? This is the type of error you'll probably encounter. Cannot read property state of undefined. Yep. We ran into that error because we didn't bind, so it doesn't know. If we go back and look at it, you could sort of parse that out by looking at this error. Show a little bit of practice to get used to reading these, but it's a really good thing to spend some time trying to figure out what it's telling you before you just start mucking around in the code. So it cannot read property state of undefined. So if we go and look at what it's pointing at, it says here's state, but state isn't the thing undefined there. This is what it sees as undefined, right? Which tells us that there's a problem with this scope not having this, and we need to do something about it. Now from there, it's a little bit of a jump to realize that it's the bind that you needed to do. But it helped guide you to where your problem was. So the bind should hopefully fix that. And now it's going to start yelling at me. Yeah, I really hate that it's working. It shouldn't be. I know why it is. It's because of where I'm managing the state and what's re-rendering. So it's sort of a coincidence, which is unfortunate. Hey, I also see something else now that I realize I think we want to do. I don't know what you guys think, but probably want Clear to clear out those lists too. So, all right, let me really wish, I wonder if I can figure out how to make this not work that way. I could, but it would introduce too much complexity. I feel like. So the reason it's working is because of this tick logic. We're in a sort of weird coincidence state here, where since all of this is the same component, this whole component is re-rendering. So let me see if it'd be pretty ugly if I do that, but. Nah, I'll just probably talk about it instead of trying to make that change. So the problem with what we've done here is a couple things. We've got two issues. One, we're not calling set state, right? So we're actually not telling React to re-render when we're making this change. We're not telling it, hey, this component needs re-rendered and update. So I guess I think I am going to do this, even though it's a little convoluted, just to try and emphasize what's going on here. Is I'm going to make a I'm not even going to pull it into a separate file. I'm going to be, because this is more for just teaching on this, and this will be a lot easier for the rest of the code. I'm going to introduce a new class, new component right here. And this is actually going to manage the state for this. I think this is going to work the way I want. Not all the state, but a chunk of it. I'm basically going to copy all this and then rip out most of it. So what this guy's going to render is very, very simple. Instead of all this complexity, he's going to render this stopwatch and just pass him in the lap times. Basically, I'm just pulling this state out up another level. It also needs to pass in the logic for when a lap triggers. Which I think is fine. This isn't where a tick is going to occur. It is where this one isn't where the clear logic is going to live. This isn't where our start or pause logic is going to live. And if this is what's happening, then we need to change some stuff here as well. We're not going to have start or pause or tick or clear. Our on lap actually needs to take in a time, because that's what I'm going to push on here. So you'll see what I'm doing here in a minute. I might leave it separate just for the sake of the rest of this class. We could bring it back in later. So I'm still going to have an on lap here that we're going to pass down. And what this is going to do is, instead of doing all this logic, this is going to just call right down to what got passed into it. Passing the elapsed time. So that should be fine, I think. I think this will work. Oh, I know what I need to do. What's the name of this guy? Stopwatch lap state. I'm going to change my export here. So nothing else even needs to know that I changed my component that they're getting, I don't believe. All right, let's see how much I screwed up in this. Cannot read property map of undefined. This isn't a state anymore. This is a prop. It's getting passed in. All right, let's see. You're still actually showing up there, huh? Let me figure out why that's the case. Changing this state. We passed it in. That guy renders. Oh, because he's still bound to the actual live data. It's not copying it. All right, I'm going to do something else different here. So this is all happening as a result of this oddity that I'm talking about. I'm pretty sure. Let's see if I can get this there. There we go. So now it's behaving the way I expected. I'm now producing the problem that I intended to show. The rest of it was all just to challenge that. So now we've got that logic that I have, with same logic that we just had that was showing the number of, or the times that we press the button, and it's not showing the times from the button presses anymore. And the only change we made to do that was this little bit of logic right there that I'm going to strip back off. So this gets into, this is sort of an important concept to understand, is the way this stuff should work. Is whether something has a reference to the data or whether it has a copy of the data. So what happens, and we talked a little bit about this before, what happens with an array or an object is that when you pass that, like when I pass this array in as the lap times property to this, it's not passing a copy of the items in the array. Instead it's passing, I'll draw it on the board over here, instead it's passing a pointer to that array. So it's passing a reference to that array. So essentially what we have is this stopwatch lap time component has a reference to this as a variable called lap times. But what that's doing is pointing to this point in memory, which is our array of data. So this guy just has a variable that just points over to this array. And when we create our stopwatch component and we pass in the props to it, what we're passing to it is not this data directly, like copied into here, but just another thing pointing to this data. So what was happening here is that, and this gets into this whole complexity, is since we're passing a pointer to that data and that area has been updated, then when this tick gets called, which is calling set state and causing us to re-render, then it's getting the newest version of, it has the, since it's pointing to that same data, it re-renders and it renders with the data that it points to. So it has all of the entries and renders those. Now what I did with the little bit of change that was made up here, when I put this square brackets around it and the dot, 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 there's several ways to do this. This is one of the newest shorthand notations. But what this is basically doing is saying, copy this whole array, create a copy of it here. And this, what I pass in here points to the copy and not to my original data, right? So every time this,
brackets or the periods?
that's what the dot, dot, dot and the brackets are doing. Got this stopwatch lap state, I call this. Yeah, so this is spreading. So it's taking all of the items out of that original array and creating a new array, and just putting all those items into it. There's other syntaxes that are more verbose that you can use to do the same thing. But the reason I did that in this is I'm trying to emphasize that just by adding items, we're still adding items to this original array. So every time we press the button, and I can show that in a minute, but every time we press that button, we're adding another item to this array. We're adding another item to the array. So let's show that. So instead of logging lap pressed, let's log lap times. Let's log this value each time we press it. Let's see what happens. We can see that our array is changing, but nothing is changing in our render over here, right? And I know this is a little drawn out, but I think it's very useful to do this because I've burned myself on this many times as well. So, and the reason that's happening is because we're not telling React to re-render our stopwatch lapse state component. So since it doesn't re-render this, it doesn't call this render method, so it doesn't create a new copy of the state of the lap times array to pass in, which means that this stopwatch only has a reference to its original copy of it, and its original copy had nothing in it, right? So the first thing you need to realize is that the only way you should update state for a React component, you should never update the variables in the state directly, like what they point to or anything. You should always do it by calling set state, right? So the next way, like you might think to try and do this is like this dot set state, lap times, and then I'll even just, I'll pull this whole line out, right? I'll say lap times dot push time. We're adding a new one into lap times, and we want to have it work like that. So now we're setting our state, right? We're changing something. But let's see what happens with that. So this should break too. Might break even worse. Boom! Now it really blew up. Sort of what I expected. And the question is why? Well, if we went and looked at the documentation for the array push method, let me get rid of this. The push method adds one or more elements to the end of an array and returns the new length of the array. So what we have written here now in our code is lap time returned from this operation. So the first time it happens, it adds a new item to our original lap times array, but then it returns 1 because that's the length of our array now. And now lap times is no longer the array, it's the value 1, right? But there's still sort of a fundamental problem with what we've done here. So we could do this same thing. Let's pull that back out like we had it. Or I'll just do lap times dot push time like we had originally. And then here I'll say, and I'll use the shorthand. So because it's the same name as the variable, I don't have to type it out. Lap times is being set to lap times, right? The local variable lap times. But the shorthand notation is like this. So now we've pushed it on and we're saying, all right, assign this back to what our array was. Now I'm not certain this is going to fail. I don't know, but I hope it will because that'll make it a lot easier to explain. All right, it's not going to. So the danger here, there's also a danger here, and it's an easy one to make, and in this case, we're not getting burned by it, is that when you set state, what you want to be doing to make sure that this is getting, you should never, or let me step back, never mutate the value of something that's in the state. Always create something new and set the state to that new item. So what we're doing here is our state, our lap times in our state points to this array, and then we're mutating the value of that array because when you do push, it doesn't create a new array. It adds another item to the end of the array and adds another item to the end each time. And the danger there is React may not, again, recognize that the object has changed, because if it's just looking at the pointer, it'll say, oh, I point to the same thing I pointed to before. I don't need to change anything. I don't need to actually update my state at all. Nothing needs to change. And if it does that, then you would have the situation where you're still not getting your new data, right? So in order to guard against that, and this is all the tricky bits of what we're dealing with here, is you need to actually create a copy, just like I was doing down here, of your array each time, and you can do it with different syntaxes. create a copy and then assign that new array that we're creating each time in to our lap times. Actually, hold on. I want to try something before I do that. The reason this may have worked is because I was doing this. Because I was copying it. Let me try this real fast. No, it's still working. Oh well. But yeah, what you want to do is copy your object or an array. So if you're ever working with an object or array, you don't want to change values on them. You want to copy it and then put that new copy into your state each time. So I know that's a lot. That was very sort of drawn out, but this is a very, very easy mistake to make. And this is the deal when you're working with stuff that is a reference is when you're mutating that state, React may not realize that the state is being changed. It depends on how it's doing its comparison on your component.
That's in particular with when your state is referring to arrays and objects.
Yeah.
For this kind of thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because if it's a string or a number, those are just always by value. So it doesn't, you never pass around a reference to them. Yeah. Yep. All right. So like I said, that was pretty drawn out, but the reason this tick logic made it sort of hid what was going on, because this is forcing the state to be updated. It's forcing a re-render, and that re-render reads whatever the values are at that point in time. So this is sort of safeguarding us against this common mistake in React components. It's helping us out a little bit. Otherwise, you know, this may have been able to burn us. So I'm going to, let me see now. All right, next step. Settings. Let's pull the logic back down in, because it'll just be easier if it all lives in this one place right now. Bring it back in. Lap time. Add it here, get rid of that. Now this is state again. In our very primitive version. And we can change what we export out of here to just be our stopwatch, and I don't think we need that component that was up there. Double check, make sure. Time is not defined. Oh. It's got an issue with this. I'm gonna get rid of this whole thing. Time is not defined. That shouldn't be the case. It shouldn't be trying to get the time. This.state.lap times. Brought you back in here. Oh. Wait, this dot on lap, yeah. All right, what did I screw up? Welcome to the live coding bit. Binding. That's what I was yelling about, right? Line, oh no, it's saying line 51. I don't know what's going on. Let me delete all this again. Maybe it was saying the right place. All right, let's try this one more time. What are we on about? Time is not defined because it's probably line 51 now. Ah. Right. It's the elapsed time. There we go. Easy enough. So now it should work, and that should work even if we're not updating with the tick interval stuff. So the next thing, what's the next thing you guys want to do? Maybe clean up these and we hit clear. I don't know if people implemented that in their code, but that would probably be the next thing I'm thinking. Be like, all right, let's delete our times when we clear. So that's really easy. Just add something else that we clear. Lap times is just a new empty array. Look at how easy that was for us to clean that up. We didn't have to do any logic. We don't have to tell React, oh, re-render, oh, get access to this element. Like for somebody who's, again, I point this out to people who are familiar with like traditional web development. We don't have to say, oh, go to these places where I put this stuff in the DOM and delete those because I cleared. And make sure that this div is now something, maybe I need to change the state of that or change a class on it. Like, we don't have to do any of that logic. We just said, oh no, I changed the value in my state and re-render and render off of having nothing there, and it deals with all that logic for us, right? That's really stinking nice. That's sort of the magic that React gives you in terms of the way you get to reason about stuff. So it was really trivial for us to do that. So now we've got, okay, we're rendering something, but what was the next thing that people mentioned? We've got a problem with, well, we want these numbers to be, maybe we want, let's make them prettier to render, right? Let's make it a little prettier. Whatever they are right now, and then that'll be easier for us to deal with. Yeah, we'll do something like that. So here's how I would handle this, and we could do this a lot of different ways. Is I'm gonna create another component that's like lap times. Yeah. Whew, it's toasty in here tonight. Create another component, we'll call it lap times. So it's going to be similar to our stopwatch, but different. It's going to be very, very simple. I'm actually going to hop over here, import my React stuff, and then I'm just going to make it a functional component. I'm going to take some properties in, which are just some lap times. And what it's going to do is, right now, for the sake of not adding more complexity, let's basically take our logic that we had here, our little stopgap logic, and just move it over. Right? It'll need to be a little different than that, but because we don't have state, it's a prop that we pass in. All right. We've got a very, very simple lap times component now, right? It's doing the same thing that our previous component did. This is actually going to have a problem. I forgot. I'm going to have to introduce one other thing, but we'll see that in a second. So we need to import this guy. Lap times.js. And now I'll just invoke it. And what does it take as an argument? What's its properties? Just the lap times that we have, right? So we can just pass that straight in, this dot state dot lap times. All right, let's see if this works. I'm not exporting it. There we go. Being extra lazy and putting it all in the same line. Now it's yelling at me for some other reason. Cannot read property props of undefined. Oh, it's because the functional component, it doesn't have a this. That's my prop straight in. So we get here. Yay! We're rendering. Right? So I'm gonna address this bit here now. Each child in the array or iterator should have a unique key property. We haven't done a lot with arrays in our stuff, but this is I'm actually surprised. I expected it to air out on that. There's technically something wrong with this syntax because a component should only ever return, like what it returns should be one element at the top level, but this is returning an array of elements. I guess the newer version of React does support that. Traditionally, React hasn't supported returning an array directly. Newer versions of React do support that, which is really nice. Because before you would have had to basically wrap this in a div and then render your stuff inside of that div, even though you don't care about that div at all necessarily. But what it's yelling at us about is whenever you're doing an array, and this is a map returns an array of stuff, React wants to be able to uniquely identify each item in that array. And that's because when it goes to try and re-render, if it has an identifier for each item in it, it's able to know, oh, I need to re-render this or I don't need to re-render this. It's able to keep that association as stuff moves around. Whereas if they don't have an identifier associated with them, this key, then it has to re-render all of them because it can't know if it's the same item as it was before. And there's a lot of ways to do that. Probably the simplest is when you do map, there's another argument, a couple other arguments, but you can pass in the index, which is what item in this array you're on. Good.
I don't know why, because I would like an alternative to that.
The alternative would be, so usually, let me see here. I got something wrong in my syntax, I think. Unexpected token. Oh, I have too many parentheses, I think. There we go. So let's see, that should, so the alternative is usually when you're passing stuff around, a lot of times it's got some sort of unique identifier already on the object that you're rendering or something like, oh, this is its ID. This is the ID of this item we're rendering. This is the GUID, or like an example from work, like I could use recently, like, oh, this is a book we're rendering, and each book has a lot of unique things, but maybe the title is unique, right? And it's better to use those items as your keys because those are guaranteed to, or much more, make sure you think about it a little bit, but those are, what you want is something that says this is the same item. Because let's say if we had this array, and instead of, for whatever reason, yeah, I got a great reason. Instead of showing our times or pushing stuff onto the bottom of the array, we're like, oh, let's push the new time into the front of the array instead of the end. That way, when we render, we just render from beginning to end and the most recent lap time is at the top, right? What that would do now is every other item that was in your array, its index is changed. So when React goes to map over it the next time, it will have the wrong indexes. It will think it doesn't need to re-render stuff. So the reason it sort of discourages using the index is because if you change the order of data that you pass in, that index could be off, could change, and it could mess up React's capability to track them. Whereas if instead it was something unique that didn't change with each one, then it doesn't matter if you push something on the front or the end or anything because the key will be the mapping.
So the key always needs to be part of the data, any element in the data, or you can create a separate key. If you don't have any, like here, if we don't want to use the index, I also can't use the laptop with the time or lap time.
Right.
Because you can repeat that.
Those could be the same.
So what will you do here?
I mean, I'll be honest, I'm pretty lazy with this and I use the index more than I should. Right? When really you shouldn't. So if you're really trying to avoid that, like what you would do is when you like save your lap times, instead of it just being a number, you would save an object that might have like the time and then an ID.
Oh, okay. So they did.
And then the ID would be what you would use in each one of these instances, right? And you may generate that ID uniquely. So there's tools out there, like there's something known as a GUID, which is, I think it's supposed to stand for globally unique identifier. So like a GUID is, find an example of one real fast if I can. So this is an example of a GUID, which is an ID that, you know, there's a lot of things that can generate these. There's a spec for how to generate these, more or less. And you may be surprised, but given that this is like 128 bits, yeah, this is 128 bits is big enough, and the generation algorithm is unique enough that if 1 billion GUIDs per second were generated for 1 year, the probability of duplicate would be only 50%. Or if every human on Earth generated 600 million GUIDs, there would only be a 50% probability of a duplicate. So, you know, there's a possibility of a collision, but incredibly low with GUIDs. So that's usually the approach used if you need to generate something like a unique identifier yourself. You could also, like, since you don't care, you might do something like just add your own, it sounds weird to say, add your own number that's basically the index into it. But at least then you know you're the one assigning it and you're keeping track of it separately. So it's something where you're not going to have the array ordering issue. All right, so let's tweak this a little bit more, right? We got something very simple here going on, but it's ugly. That's not pretty at all. Wait a minute. We already have a pretty way to display the time. So what if I just import, what is it called here? My time display. What if I import this guy, and instead of let me break this stuff up a little more so that it's a little easier to read. I hope, there we go. And then split that down to that line so that we're actually returning is here on its own line. So our time display, oops, need to end there. And then what does, let me double check here. What does the time display expect as its property? Expects time. So let's pass in a time property. Oh, it looks like I can just make this self-closing. It doesn't take a child, it takes a time property. I'll put the key first. Oh, time, because I'm inside of this loop, right? All right, let's see how this goes.
Wow.
Well, it works, but yeah, what's that?
It's like it's big things like this. Yeah, taking the style of the time display.
Yeah.
So you need to change that.
So I need to change that, right? So there's a lot of ways to do this. This is where, this is an interesting space. This is where there's not like the answer. There's not like, this is the way to do it. But one common approach, one way to do something like this would be like, okay, well, maybe I want my time display to be able to support different variants of the time. So what we could do is, one thing we could do is expose the fact that it's using this typography underneath, right? And let something pass in the variant themselves and use a default value if I didn't get one passed in. That's one possibility. So we could do that first, right? Like we could say something like this. I'm going to let variant equal, and this is a shorthand, this dot props dot variant. So I'm just checking if this is already there. Like if somebody passed in a value for this, then I want it to use that. So this is using a ternary expression, which we haven't written a lot of. Then I want it to be this dot props dot variant. Otherwise, I want to default to, let's say, display 4, right? And now I'm going to change this to use be equal to variant. So let's just double check. Oh, something's wrong. Cannot read property props of undefined. Oh, this is a functional component, not a object. So let's see. All right, well, everything's working the way I expect, right? But now I could say, maybe there's a different typography I want to use. I'll just use, I don't know. I'll use body 1 or something. Maybe it's going to be too small, but let's try it. So in our lap times, we'll go ahead and pass in a variant. And we can see what happens. Nope.
You have another this.
I have another, of course I do. Look at that. Love me my class components, don't I? All right, let's try that again. There we go. I got something small, right? There's other schools of thought too that say stuff like, so I'm just showing you one approach here. There's schools of thoughts that say you shouldn't really expose the underlying way that stuff's structured. So it would be like, oh, well, don't pass the variant through because now you're bound to this being like this typography thing. So some schools of thought might say something like, instead, you should have this guy have a unique property. He'll have the option of a small, right? So he could have an optional small property, and if that's set to true, it's going to be different. So then you might do it a little differently like this. You might say variant equals props dot small. Then let's just set this to like body 1, otherwise set it to like display 4, right? And now what would happen is here is instead of passing in the variant, and one cool thing about React is if you just define a property, it sends a truthy value for it, so I don't have to set this equal to true. It's automatically truthy by declaring it here, otherwise false. So now we've got the same sort of thing, but we've sort of encapsulated it behind this. You don't really know how the time display is handling that. I don't know if any of these approaches are better than another one. Like you can see the arguments of, well, this lets it be more like decoupled from the underlying typography element, but it also means that we don't have as many options, right? You'd have to code in a lot more options if you wanted to allow it to support a lot of more variations. Because, oh, well, this supports only 2, whereas before we supported every possible typography variant. Yeah. So I don't know, I'm just showing some different approaches that people can use. Another option would be, and some people subscribe to the option, which is, well, don't overload this time display component. Instead, create a whole nother component that is sort of the same thing, but is the small time display or something else, and use that directly. And that way it's not props based, at least not visible to like the lap times, right? But you may have a underlying thing that's doing this logic still hidden behind it, right? That's trying to abstract all of this variant logic behind multiple components instead of one component. I've looked at sort of all of those approaches. I haven't found any, in my mind, compelling reason why one is really superior to another one in all cases, or why it's like the approach people should take. But what I would say is probably best if you're building an app to try and stick with one of the approaches for the app pretty much across the board so that it's consistent. I think that's the best thing, right? But there's not like, this is the way to build something like this out.
In the real world, do you have UX people or someone who have like someone has really clear like what they want, like, okay, because there you can have small or big, like straightforward body, because the client already told you, okay, we have this. Or maybe they can come like when you're coding, oh, you know what? Let's add this thing to this, like.
So I think that's
I mean, I don't know, I'm just.
no, I think that's a great question. I think, I can't give you all the answers to that because it varies so much from place to place. What I can say is, here's how it's been in different teams I've been. You can probably talk about people that you've worked with too at times, but here's what I can say about people that I've worked with in the different teams I've been on, right? Is on some of the teams, there hasn't been a lot of external direction on what the UI is. It's been more the team, like the developers or the people on it, working something out, and then you'll take it to like other stakeholders, other business people, and say, hey, here's what we're thinking, and they may give feedback at that point, like, oh, could we change this, change that? On some teams I've been on, the stakeholders are very much wanting, like, here's our specific vision. This is what we want it to look like. So try and just implement that vision. And then on like the one I'm on now, there's a lot more, I'd say there's sort of a back and forth aspect to it where, but it's not, one thing that we're lacking and is these reusable building blocks. So it can vary depending on who you're working with, right? And sometimes someone may give you a whole bunch of things that are all sort of one-off-y designs. But if you're working usually with a larger company or a decent sized company, they try and have the idea of some set of reusable things so that there's a consistency across the board. That's what React is really good for. A component is a reusable element, right? So usually they'll try and say, like, here are the reusable pieces that you can build something out with. Here are building blocks. Try and stick with these is what you build something out with, but we're not telling you exactly how to put those pieces at times. They'll say, just use these pieces so it looks the same as our other stuff, but then you've got some flexibility within that space. I don't know. I imagine if you're working directly with clients on one-off projects, I guess it also varies depending on the client as to whether they're like, here's our vision, go implement it, or hey, we just have an idea, can you deliver that, and you have to come up with a lot of the approaches to it.
Yeah, most of my clients are not tech savvy, so for example, like in this class, if you just took anything off of the material UI, I think most of the people that I'm working with would be pretty like blown away by that. Like, I think that looks amazing. So in some ways, my clients have low standards on technology. Yeah, I would say.
Sometimes good, sometimes bad.
Yeah, yeah. And most do not have like a really clear, they just don't have marketing budgets. They don't have a lot of that you would have with any like larger clients have more specific practice.
Yeah.
So there's probably some correlation with the size of the client and the group you're working with, how much input they're going to bring to it and how much direction, how many stakeholders they're trying to lead.
Yeah, that's very true. And a lot of times I've worked, that's why I can't speak for a lot of stuff, because most of my work has been with larger companies, where it's weird. You'd think in a larger company there would be that specific look, but we never actually had that on a lot of mine, but it was still driven by a bunch of stakeholders. So it was like the top, like us coming up with stuff, but then a whole bunch of stakeholders taking it and working like, oh, let's change this, change that, change this, change that. And heavy challenges there. But then we had to implement most of it. The team I'm with now, our stakeholders have a lot more vision as to what they're trying to get. And so there's a lot more that's given to us, like, try and do this thing. But that still doesn't, as a developer, a lot of times you're balancing a lot of different things, especially on web development, because they'll say, hey, try and do this. And you'll say, okay, well, I could do that, but it's really complicated on the web. Or I could do this other thing that's similar and is 5 times faster for me to implement because it doesn't have the challenges, right? Because there are some things that are just hard to do or hard to work with. A current example of something in our design that's part of what I'm working with that is a challenge consistently is that websites are very good at being having flexible height, just adjusting as tall as they need to be for their content, right? And they're not particularly good at you saying like, I need my things in my website to be just this tall, but what goes in it, maybe a different amount of text on all of them. And I want that thing to be able to handle that in a flexible way. There's not, other than, just like let it scroll, there's not really a very good way to handle that, right? And so that's part of our requirements that we've been dealing with, but it is a lot more challenging than if we had a different design, which didn't have that as a constraint, because that means we're having to fight a lot of the way that a website wants to work. So. All right, I'll just leave it with this for now. We may pretty this up a little more later, add in some numbers or something else, but I just wanted to get it smaller. We've got some numbers showing up. So the next bit that we've already talked about, and this is the logic part, is how are we going to properly capture our lap times instead of our lapse time, right? So this is where I could write it out, but I'm looking for what do you guys come up with as a solution? Did you solve this?
Yeah, so I used a reduce. I was basically figuring out what I want to do is take the time, the last one that goes into the array. My logic was to add up, I think this is what I did, add up the other times in the array, subtract it, and then that will give me the difference between all the other lap times up until now and then my last little one. If that makes sense. Maybe that's very complicated, but it was only a line of code, and then I had one fix for one other if statement for my, just in case I was on the first lap.
Okay.
So it's probably confusing, I don't know how to explain it.
That's interesting.
I mean, yeah, I can.
I think that, but I think I wasn't excessive, but in the state, I just like last lap equals 0, like the state thing.
Haha.
So because of that, because I've never
Yeah.
the first one,
Yeah.
I have like
Okay.
0 things to start with.
So I needed my state to be empty because I'm checking, I'm showing my lap area, and I need to check, if I put a 0 in there, it's gonna show my lap. So we kind of went about it slightly different
Gotcha.
ways.
Oh, you're showing you're showing 2 times. You're showing your total time and the time on this lap so far, is what you're saying as well.
No, just how you have it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'll show you. I'm thinking through this as we talk, right? So here's my approach. Let me know what you guys think
What's
about
your
this.
approach, Jay?
I don't know. We're gonna see how this goes.
All right.
But it's not far off from yours. It's gonna be very similar, just probably with some defaults that help me out a little bit. So I'm gonna do something similar to what Amina did here. Last lap time, I'm starting it at 0.
Oh, yeah,
Okay.
and in on that, I have a variable called last lap time that has the formative time, and it's an operation. It's this state lapse time, which you were doing, minus that last lap thing, this state last lap. And that is the data that I use a different approach. I just concat for the array.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm putting that information into the array, and then my display, I used a map thing. So it shows, LI
Right.
element within an OL.
Yeah.
So I have the 1, 2, 3, and it's shown. So it's.
That's not. No. It's good. Yeah, this will be very, very similar, I think. So this is very similar. And I'm going to change some of this other code here while I do this, just to show you another way to write some of this, to simplify it again, is, I'm gonna say my lap time equals this dot state dot elapsed time minus this dot state dot last lap time.
Yeah.
So this is going to capture the difference between the last time I captured a lap and the current time and call that my lap time.
Is that supposed to be a minus? Yeah.
Oh yeah, thank you. Now what I'm gonna do here is also a little bit shorthand. I did this push before, right? But what this is doing is actually just saying create an array and take all the items in my previous array and add them here. So I don't actually even need to push. I can just put this other one here at the end of my new array. Because that's all it's doing. It's just an array. All the items from my old array plus this item in my array. But what I also want to do here is update my last lap time to be, and there's really, I'm sort of doing something here that's dangerous. You're not actually supposed to read your state inside of your set state. There's a little bit of a, I could talk about why you're not supposed to read your current state inside of set state. It's not a big deal with what we're doing, but there's a potential edge case there that could be an issue. So I've updated my lap times and my last lap time. So every time I click the button, it should capture my current lap time and update this. I don't know if this is gonna work. We're gonna see. Let's see if I'm missing something or if this works. Cross my fingers. Let's do like 5 seconds because I'm incredibly fast. Let's try it again, somewhere around there. Sweet. So I love the reduce logic, by the way. I love somebody using that because that's a great way to do it. You don't have to store an extra value using the reduce logic, right? You don't have to store the last lap time.
Exactly. Yeah, that's not a state.
Yep. So it's not, and there is this like a common refrain for React is to try and store the minimal data you need in your state and compute everything else instead of storing extra stuff. It's arguable whether, it's like this is better or the other approach is better. This is flatter. So if for whatever reason you let this thing run for, 1 million times and you kept doing that, it's going to be faster to calculate this because it only has to do one operation. But you're never going to get to that point, right? You're not going to have something running that long, so it's probably not something that ever matters. The reduce is storing less state in your. So the way you would do that, if you were trying to do the reduce logic here, is I'm going to just set my lap time. I'll change this a little bit. I'll get rid of this last lap time logic. I'm going to leave it in there and copy this and show you how you might do something like this with reduce. Is you would say let lap time equal, and you're still going to do the same thing like elapsed time. But what you're going to subtract from that is this dot state dot lap times. So there's a method known as reduce on arrays, and what that'll do is take each item in the array and apply it. So if we look, it sort of tells you right here, I like this, Hover. It takes a callback function, which takes the previous value, the current value, the current index number, and an array. And what that's going to do is, I thought I accepted a default value too, but maybe not. Oh, that's the second argument, I think. This is showing the callback function. There's a second argument, I think, to reduce. I could be wrong. It may not exist in JavaScript. But what you would do here is you would say, all right, this reduce function that I want here, I'm going to put it down here. So I'll call this my sum. The previous value is my sum. And then my current value is my current lap time, I guess. that I'm computing. And what I want to do is return the sum plus the current lap time. So basically what I'm doing is I'm just summing up all of my lap times that I've got. And I'm taking whatever my elapsed time is and subtracting out the sum of all of these different lap times added up. Let me double check on reduce over here too. So I don't know if reduce actually in JavaScript takes a second argument. Very well may not.
I was trying to find the quickest, easiest way to just add up values in an array. And it seemed really complicated to me, but I'm copying and pasting
It does take an initial value. All right, sweet. So I'm also going to pass in, and the syntax is going to be a little weird or whatever, the initial value of 0 for the array. Let's see if this works. This is going to yell at me for some reason. Duplicate declaration lap time. Oh, I didn't comment out my other line. There we go. All right, let's try this. Let's give it a little while. Got about 5 seconds. Let's see what we get here. Yep. So I don't know if that's clear what's happening, but here's what's going on. Each time we click the lap button, it takes whatever our lapse time is, and it subtracts the sum of all of our previous lap times. That's what this reduce is doing, is reduce is just iterating over every previous lap time, summing them together and giving you a single value back out. And so it's subtracting that, and that's how you can get whatever the current lap time is. Now, my current lap time is all of my other laps, the total time elapsed minus the time I've spent on every other lap I've run, right? So that's another way to write it where you don't actually have to store a secondary value. And you can just compute it, without that secondary value. That's a very, functional type approach to have that sort of approach as well. So I think it's pretty slick. I think this one's probably a little easier to parse for somebody who's, hasn't worked with stuff like that. So this is what I would start with at least. It's nice that, I think given the extra time, everyone sort of got a solution, which is great. We can get rid of this console log, this ugly thing we don't need. And now, we've got functioning lap times now. Now, of course, we could, in this case, it's pretty ugly output. We could obviously prettify that a lot more, like you said, with an ordered list and list items. Like if we changed the way these displayed, like let's make this a little more complex here. Instead of just returning this way, let's return an ordered list. And then for each one of these items in my, well, now I'm inside of JSX, so I need to make this like JSX syntax. And this is where a lot of times, other people will just write this inline here. I don't really like doing that type of thing. A lot of times I will, because I have a hard time parsing what's going on when I've laid it out that way. I'll just create another function to help me out here. Heck, I'll just call it lap time. I'll even make it a component. It doesn't matter. It'll just take some props itself, and it'll return the list item followed by this, although it'll be a little different than this, not much, because the key won't be in here. Because you have to, whenever you're using keys on arrays, you need it to be where the map or something like that is happening. And then we can close our list item. So now I've got lap times. And now I'm going to change this to on a lap time. And then so pass a time into it. So time, and let's set the key to the index. It's sort of non-optimal key setting. So let me see here. That's right. I've got too many of that. I need to indent this so that it's clear that's my children of this guy. And that I'm returning from here. Let's see what happens. I don't know if this is going to work. We're going to find out. Time is not defined. Oh. Let's see. There we go. And then you could start doing whatever else you wanted to make it, style it up a little more, right? So we could, you know, you've got your common patterns like, oh, if I'm going to have a long list of these, I want to have each one alternating in color, and CSS can let you do that pretty easily to say every other row in some bit of data, apply this styling to it. You could also do it very easily with, instead of doing, you know, sort of a CSS selector, you could do that very easily with these right inside of here in this component or something where, say, you pass the index in so it knew what it does get this key, even though it's not clear. You could say like, oh, if my key is an odd number, then apply this styling, otherwise apply this styling, right? But, I mean, all really interchangeable at this point. And really, I mean, at least I hope it seemed that way. Like it's, oh man, totally had a problem there. That initial one must have an issue after all.
I don't know what that was. I happened to need that. That's what I had the first.
If I click it too soon, that's interesting. I don't know why.
Have you cleared that one? That state?
Ah, maybe. Let me see. Yeah. That's why. That's why. Yep. See, I'm missing a bit of state cleanup, right? On clear, I need to set my last lap time. 0. Cool. I mean, I hope this was useful, like exercise again. I like to try and work through these things hands-on after people have had a chance. Get to see somebody else solve it. You know, sounds like you guys were doing something very, very similar in solving it. So I think that's great. I think next time we'll probably, I don't know if we'll actually get very hands-on, but next time I'll talk a lot about data and state to start setting up for talking about the different state management solutions that are out there. So that means I'll probably have to work on some slides actually, because there's a lot of complexity around state, and we've been working with stuff pretty simple so far. So that'll be more of a overview of why there's these tools, and then we'll probably dabble on some of what those tools are, these other state management solutions going forward.
Do they also write something about static prop type thing? Like they do some kind of template of the props are on top of the component, then I didn't understand what it was. So
Yeah, there's a lot of different stuff you can do with that. So like there's default props that you can have. So, you know, I had, like, for example, on this this time display, when we were doing that variant version, it was like, oh, if it's this, then do display 4. If I don't have a variant, then do display 4. Otherwise, that could have been handled in a different way, because I don't know if you can do it for a functional component, but you can for class components, where you can say like the default prop value for this is this, and then if somebody doesn't pass in a value for that property, it'll default to that, which is a really nice way to have stuff automatically default. The static, so there is some static stuff.
Prop types. I don't know if it's.
Well, prop types is a little different. That's sort of a guard. We'll talk about that in one of our classes. So maybe I'll touch on that next class too. Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Things.
Yes, we can use that.
Prop types are just a tool to help you catch possible errors in your code.
Okay.
That's really prop types. Yeah, prop types
So
help.
there was Boolean or number or string or-
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's what it's about. It's to make sure, like, oh, you passed the wrong type of property into this guy. I'm yelling at you about it. Right? And we'll talk about that. It's much more important when you're working on like very small things. It's not as important to worry about. But when you start getting into larger scale stuff and data is passing around through multiple places, and it's like, oh, this comes in from here. You're like, I sort of want to make sure that this gets the things I expect it to receive, no matter what the data comes from. Then it's really useful, especially when you're working with multiple people. It's a way to help enforce. So when they try to use a component, it'll yell at them like, hey, this should have been a string. Don't try and pass a number in here. I don't know what to do with a number. So that's where a lot of that stuff comes in handy. And then there's a lot of, I've really limited the syntax to stuff that's pretty much universal, but there's a lot of syntax that can make some of this nicer, like that binding that we have to do. There is a syntax that sort of bypasses the need for that, but it's not yet spec. So I've avoided it because it's incredibly popular. A lot of people are writing it, but until it's fully like in the spec, I've been avoiding it as something to teach, just so people don't get expected, oh, this is how it works, and then, oh, it doesn't actually work that way. Never mind, we changed how we wanted it to work. So it's happened before to JavaScript. Like there was something that was incredibly popular, which was there were observers built into like object.observe. There were these observers that were built into the language, and it was built into Chrome, and there was a whole bunch of documentation around it, and like Google wrote all sorts of stuff, and then they were like, blah, we pulled it out. We ripped this out of the language. Yeah, we thought it was going to be in, but it wasn't quite there. Everybody was writing against it, and now we decided this shouldn't have been in. It was a mistake, right? And this is probably the biggest reason that I avoid introducing stuff that's like almost there, but not quite, because I'm like, I don't want this was heavy. There's still libraries that absolutely depend on this functionality. So even though this has been deprecated, and I think all the other browsers have pulled out support, there are some things that actually only work on Chrome, because I think Chrome still has this work, I believe, and the other browsers have pulled it out, and Chrome's like, oh, we're not going to pull it out because we wrote some libraries internally that required it. And so that's the danger of relying on stuff that's not yet spec.